Welcome, everybody. This is the Rotary eClub of Silicon Valley. Every week, we try to bring you stories of innovation, of entrepreneurship, and education. We look to find ways to inspire people to take good ideas into their communities and improve those communities in truly cool and fun ways. And so we have a large group of people in our club, about 35, 40 folks who come from all sorts of different backgrounds, not just the tech world, as you might expect from the Rotary eClub of Silicon Valley, but we have people in the financial sector, in the education sector, in the legal sector, and many more. Matter of fact, after this recording, I intend to go see Treasurer Heather, a chiropractor, and my life will be far better because of it. So at any rate, this week we have with us a speaker from the eastern side of the United States, and Greg Martin is the upper school dean at the Perkiomen. Did I say it right?
Yep, Perkiomen, correct.
Perkiomen School in Pennsburg, Pennsylvania. He has had a raft of roles in that and similar schools, and I am excited for him to give us a sense not just of what happens at his school, but of how you begin to think about building the team for any organization. What is it about people who are in younger generations who are coming through, and how do they see their possibilities as a part of the organizations they want to join? And today we will get a lot of good information on that front. Greg, I hand it over to you.
Thanks. I'm excited to be here, and I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with people and sort of have this out there, because it's definitely a topic that's ramping up, and this idea of how our independent schools specifically, and even if we want to shrink that down a little bit more, how boarding schools are staffing to meet sort of the expectations and serve their student populations when we have a really big change going on within the demographic of the American workplace. So I'm going to talk a little bit right now, sort of in general, about what I'm seeing at schools and some of the problems we're facing in the boarding school world, or the challenges that are coming up in the boarding school world, that all schools are, I don't want to say that they're recognizing, but it's definitely part of this situation with staffing that the National Business Officers Association is talking about, the National Association of Independent Schools is talking about, the Association of Boarding Schools is talking about. And what it comes down to is, starting in 2010, that was our first cohort of baby boomers that hit retirement age. And since 2010, every year that number has increased. So it means we have baby boomers retiring at a high rate, with fewer people coming in to take their places within independent schools. And at the same time, the people that are arriving on campus and choosing to teach as a profession, as a way of life in independent schools, they don't share the same values. They don't share the same viewpoints about what a job is. They don't have the same career aspirations. They don't have the same sort of concepts and definitions of what a job should look like. They have high expectations of their employers, and that the view of work-life balance is much more about work being part of life and not being the end-all, be-all, which is something that's kind of different to the baby boomer generation. So really, one of the things independent schools are facing nationwide, and obviously there's some markets where enrollment is still strong. If you think about, for example, the Bay Area, a lot of people out there, a lot of very good independent day schools. But nationwide, the trend is fewer students, declining enrollment. And this is a demographic that you talk to people in admissions, and they're really stressed out about it, and they think, oh, we just need to do more events to have more people see our school, and really it's worse than that. And it's about the fact that we have a shrinking school age population. There's simply fewer kids available because millennials are not having children at the same rate that we saw in Gen X, or definitely in the baby boomer cohort. So that's one of the things that schools are facing, shrinking school age population. We're also seeing cost prohibitive tuition, and it's really much like at the liberal arts college level, where we're getting to that point where it's $55,000, $60,000 for a boarding school. It's anywhere between $25,000 and say $45,000 for a day school. And families are really asking the question, okay, is this worth it? And if it is, what am I getting for my money? And one of the questions that goes with that, who are the people that are teaching my child? Who are the educators? What are their qualifications? I want that chemistry teacher to have that chem degree from Caltech. I want a PhD. I want my kid's soccer coach to be a former, major league soccer player. I want the violin instructor to be, have been first chair of the New York Philharmonic. And for many schools, the way the hiring is done, they only hire one person for all of those roles. So as one head of school put it to me back when I was doing my dissertation, many parents want Albert Einstein in the classroom, Newt Rockney on the football field, and Mother Teresa in the dorm. So for a boarding population, I mean, that's impossible. No one exists like that. The other thing we're running into is free or low-cost alternatives to independent schools. I mean, there are excellent public schools that are out there. There are excellent charter schools that are coming online all over the place. There's cyber charter schools. There are alternatives to sort of the independent school model that a lot of parents are looking at, and rightfully so. Where are you going to spend your hard-earned dollars? So what that brings us to is some pressures in independent schools that are internal. And to define an independent school, let's make that break. Private and independent are not the same thing. Private schools can be parochial, Catholic schools. They can also be independent schools. But when I say independent school, I mean a school that is governed by a self-perpetuating board of trustees. It is a 501(c) nonprofit corporation. And that's what we're talking about when we say independent schools. So independent schools, one of the things they're running into is pretty simple. They're trying to hire experts with limited budgets. So yeah, parents are saying, hey, we want that expert teacher, we want that expert coach, we want that expert residential life person. And okay, schools are going out and getting them, but are you paying them like experts? Schools run on limited budgets. They run on what we call net tuition models, where revenue-based, where if you look at the data on boarding schools, most of your boarding schools are about 75 to 85% tuition driven. In other words, they can only pay people what they make in tuition, which is, again, one of these big sort of obstacles to being able to hire the best, because you simply can't afford to pay them. And for a lot of schools, budget constraints, the reality that you have a budget that is set on the number of students that you have at your school, mean doing more with what you have. So you have to expect the people that you have on your faculty to simply wear more hats. And that's where that idea of a triple threat comes in. Somebody who can teach, somebody who can coach, somebody who can lead an activity, somebody who can do residential life work in the boarding school world. And schools are expecting or demanding even more from teachers, more committee work. We want you to be better. We need you to be better because we're charging X number of dollars for a premium product. And the expectation families have is if we're paying a premium price tag, we should have a premium product. And this is really spilling over from parents who are just demanding more for their money. And again, this isn't a problem with the parents. It's if you're going to charge a lot of money for something, the product had better be good. So some of the external pressures we're seeing, again, like I was saying, come from this idea of parents expecting more. We get it. It makes sense. But the second part to this, and this is where schools are struggling to sort of figure this out, is that Millennial and Gen Z hires expect more from their employer than simply a paycheck. They expect to be part of an organization. They expect to have a voice. They expect the organization to be aligned with their own values. And they're less willing to give themselves to the job. They're less willing to sort of do the old death of a salesman sort of mentality, where you show up at a company when you're fresh out of college, you sign a contract, and you stay there for 30, 40 years, and you retire and they give you a watch. Also needs to be noted that the structure within businesses has shifted over from having sort of the retirement package created by the business, and then that kind of went away in the late 80s, early 90s, to everyone sort of being on their own with 401 plans. But overall, these Gen Z millennials say, hey, look, I like the job, and the job provides me with money to do some of the things I want to do, but I'm not going to spend 80 hours a week on the job unless it's really worth it to me. And Gen Z and millennial hires, they don't see work in the entire notion of a job the way the baby boomers did. The baby boomers, if you look at, trace this was the land of the 30-year mortgage, where you got that job, you bought a house, you were going to be there for 30 years until that house was paid off, and then you would retire with a pension from the company. And those days are over. And in the independent school world, this is really challenging. The idea of a job it is part of your life, it is a component of your life, and there are a lot of other things you want to do. And the job doesn't necessarily define who you are as a person. It's simply something that goes along with your life. To add to that, I mean, jobs today that many people are working might not exist in 20 years, just like the job that someone who is fresh out of college is doing this year. They might go through 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different jobs and potentially even multiple careers completely unrelated to each other. So that's a big piece. As well, millennials and Gen Z hires are more transient. They move around 3 years. That's what we're seeing. So if I'm hiring a faculty member to teach at my school, it used to be that if you hired, let's say, 10 people, you would assume that 7 or 8 of them would stick around between the ranges of 3 to 7 years, with someone staying longer and a couple of people leaving earlier. Now what we're seeing is if we can get 2 years out of a new college graduate or someone in their mid-20s, 2 years is pretty much all we're seeing as being realistic. And that changes the organizational sort of feel, the organizational culture. It makes parents ask, hey, why did so-and-so leave? They were a great teacher. And to explain that to a parent, it's hard to say, hey, look, that's just what this younger generation is doing. That doesn't sell well. It's very hard for parents to sort of understand and wrap their heads around. They usually see it as a sign of something being wrong with the school. And I think we really have to note that schools are not as flexible as the corporate world. The ability, for example, I teach at a boarding school, the ability for me to say, hey, I want, a flexible work schedule where I work from home on Fridays. What does that look like? Because I have, 20 students in a class that need to be attended to, and I coach basketball in the afternoon. And oh yeah, I'm on dorm duty that weekend. So the idea of having a flexible schedule doesn't really exist. It's part of the structure of independent schools and really part of the structure of boarding schools, which makes flexibility completely impossible. So when you're looking at millennials and you're saying, hey, we want you to come work at our school, and the other alternative they have is, hey, I can work for a startup and work from home 3 days a week and kind of set my own hours, because if I have a project to do, I just get the project done and they're going to pay me more. That's not a hard discussion to have. It's a pretty simple choice. So if we run through this, what are the issues? Money. Hiring experts means you have to pay people as experts. And this seems pretty common sense. If you're going to hire an expert, a person with an advanced degree, lots of experience, you got to pay them. But if you go back to that tuition model, you are very much tied into limited resources. So you can only pay people up to a certain level, and then that's it. There is no more. And that's definitely becoming an issue with parents, because like I said before, the parents want those experts, but how are you paying them? With job flexibility being a key for millennials and Gen Z, how can independent schools be more flexible? What can they offer? What can they offer that's going to attract a millennial or a Gen Z worker to a school and get them to stay for more than a couple of years? Some schools are really saying, okay, we're going to pay off student loans. We're going to make sure that's going to happen. We might offer you down payment assistance on a house. Some schools are saying, all right, if you stay 3 years, we'll offer you a sabbatical for year 4. So some schools are being really proactive and doing some cool things. Other schools are completely doing the ostrich and sticking their heads in the sand. And knowing that work-life balance is key for millennials, at a boarding school, what do you do with that? How do you reduce the load for a millennial so they can have a better sense of work-life balance? Can you cut something out in lieu of something more? Some schools are saying, hey, look, if you want to opt out of one component of school life, that's great. We're going to take X number of dollars away from you. And that's a choice. And that seems to be working. And it works all the way up until the point that everybody wants to do that. And then you're missing components of your program. Mixing with older workers. How do you get someone who's 23, 24 to sort of line up with someone who's 56, 58? They're not reading from the same book. They didn't have the same life experiences coming online. And they don't share a lot of the same commonalities that even the baby boomer and Gen X generations would have shared, for as different as those two generations are. The millennials really look at the boomers and go, I don't get it, which is a challenge, because what does that do to your culture within the workplace? And then the last point that I sort of already alluded to was this idea of a 3-year hiring cycle, where schools are having to be much more on top of things with regard to who's leaving, who's coming, how do we get people to stay, and how do we sort of populate schools with the kind of people that we want to have around our children. offering the program that our school's mission says we're delivering. And there are a couple articles come out to take a look at. First and foremost, Deloitte recently, they do a survey every year of millennials, and specifically millennials and Gen Z in this one. And I'll pull up the PDF of that one. It's a wonderful, rich sort of document that gives you all sorts of data. And basically what they did was they went globally and they asked millennials and Gen Z workers, what's important to you on a job? Okay, well, money is important, but it's not the end all be all. They also want to find organizations that sort of mesh with their own belief systems. So they're going to work for corporations that sort of match their own personal ethos. They also have a very negative view of business, and they see businesses as being very much in it for the money as opposed to being in it for the greater good. And that's something that doesn't sit well with millennials and Gen Z. They also want a workplace that very much mirrors a more sort of inclusive, more diverse community. And in independent schools, this is a big hot button topic, hiring for diversity. If your independent school is 25% minority based, well, your faculty need to look that way too and act that way and have the same belief systems. So how do you do that? How do you attract sort of a diverse faculty into what is, traditionally been a very, very sort of, single group teaching in those places? And it goes back to also the idea that millennials don't see jobs as permanent. They move around. If they find something better, they're going to take it. And they're not going to apologize, and they're not going to feel bad about leaving the organization. They simply see it as another step in their career. So another couple articles that are pretty interesting to look at. How to make your workplace millennial friendly. I always laugh at this. And some places have done this. They put in skateboard ramps and these kind of things that I perceive as being fairly ridiculous. But at the same time, the idea is how to make the work environment more pleasurable, like you want to be at work, like you feel like it's a place you want to be. And the idea is if you want to be there, well, then you're going to stay there. And if you want to be there and you're happy, you're going to be more productive and you see how that sort of plays out. So as these demographics shift, the nature of the office changes. Some people want to open office floor plans. Jury's kind of out on whether that's effective or not. But offering things like gyms, cafes within the workplace, daycare is a huge one. This is one that boarding schools in the United States are sort of grappling with as you have two parents now working and the need for daycare. So there are a lot of things that businesses are doing that might be touch points that we could get after. But again, in education, it's not as flexible because some of the structures that exist in independent schools are far more rigid. This is a good study, comes out of Bentley University, and it kind of lines up with the Deloitte study, the multi-generational impacts on the workplace. And I think a lot of this also needs to be sort of framed in the idea that AI and that automation are ramping up. So the question is, are jobs going to be what we call them now? Are there going to be more jobs in the future? And the answer is probably less if you pay any attention to that. So what does this look like as far as societal shifts that are going to be going on with regarding work and the population and where people live and how they sort of make their way through the world? So I'm going to actually kick it over I'm going to stop sharing the screen here and come back to Rushton and see if there's anything he wants to add or ask.
Absolutely. Great information, and a lot of interesting avenues for discussing this, both in terms of schools and hiring in general. And I want to start kind of on the hiring front, actually one that's, I guess, both. When you're thinking about trying to find dynamic people, and you're assuming that they're going to be in place for, say, 3 years, this seems to be something that's well established in the international school community, right? So you look at these Singapore American School, American School of Dubai. I mean, similar schools around the world, and schools like that seem, I don't know if it's just the expectations of the people who are there who are also transient, but is that a model that becomes something that you talk about a lot in terms of independent schools here in the United States?
I think it's a model we definitely need to look at, independent schools. I think the challenge is international schools are serving a different population, generally of expats. that are sort of transient and portable anyway. So how does that mesh with maybe a school in suburban, wherever, where you don't have that transient population? But I think it's definitely worth looking at. I mean, international schools, you talk to people that work in them, and people move around. You know, I worked here, I worked there, I was in Egypt, and I was in Saudi, and then I was in Taiwan or wherever, where there's a stigma within, especially within the boarding school market, where if you move around a lot, there must be something wrong with you. And to me, that's a mindset that is flawed. Obviously, there are always situations where you do get someone who moves around a lot because there's something that's up. But I think part of that is catering to the parents. I think part of it is catering to the parents, where the parents in your domestic boarding and day schools want consistency. They want that sort of, they want to know, that Greg Martin is their child's teacher or advisor freshman year, and he's going to see them all the way through senior year. Where I think in the international market, it's a little bit more understood that, like, this is just what people do. People move around. But that's a conversation I think that has to happen within the domestic market.
It seems like that runs up against another mindset, which has to do with conformity versus exploiting in a positive sense talent, right? Yeah. So, you know, if you find somebody who's been able to do these amazing things at this school and then this school and then the British School of Tokyo, or whatever it ends up being, then, you know, any school that essentially says, we want to bring you in because of what of these kind of unique skills that you have, that's different than, we know you'll come in and be part of this team the way we know the team, right?
Right.
Is that along the same lines of mindset shift? Or?
Yeah, it definitely is. When you look, and I'll speak just purely about the boarding market, you know, say, for example, you're a teacher at a school and you teach history and you coach soccer and you coach basketball and you live in a boys' dorm. When you depart, they usually try to replicate you. They usually try to get another you, a person that teaches the same courses, coaches the same sports, will live in the same dorm, and costs the same. So, for example, you know, if you were a 25-year-old male living in a single apartment on a dorm with an undergraduate degree, they're going to try to replace you with exactly the same thing. Mm-hmm. And I think that is problematic, especially given the expectations of parents. So what I advise schools to do is to hire people for their expertise, line them up and allow them to do more of what they're good at, passionate about, and then find ways of taking those other things off the table so you don't burn them out. And so you don't put them in a situation where you're asking someone to do something that they're not particularly adept at.
It seems like for a lot of millennials, it's easy to take umbrage at the environment because it is a bit ridiculous, right? You know, the idea that you're going to replace that person who is functionally capable of doing great with 6 different roles, right, you know, at exactly the same salary as you started paying this person 3 years ago, or something like that. I mean, right, it's just silly, right? And so I don't know. I mean, I have loads of sympathy with the young person who would say, tell me again what you're asking me to do based on what? You know, I mean, so yeah, interesting stuff.
I mean, I think a lot of that is also wrapped in the labor market. I mean, the unemployment rate right now is exceptionally low. So, you know, if you say, here are the 15 things I want you to do, and here's what I'm going to pay you, and the younger people go, I can do better than that.
I can do better than that anywhere in the world, right? Like they're not limited geographically.
Right. And I think, you know, my wife and I were just watching House Hunters International, you know, and it was all these young people that are just like, oh yeah, you know, I'm from Philadelphia. I decided I want to go live in Paris. Okay. You know, I mean, my generation, and you and I are probably the same generation, Generation X, I'm assuming, you know, that was not really normal for most people, and definitely not for the baby boomer generation. So you get baby boomer bosses that are 60, 62, 63, whatever, with this Generation Y, Generation Z coming in, and they're going, what? It's just not, it doesn't make sense to them. And conversely, you know, that's on both ends of that spectrum. It doesn't make a lot of sense. For the younger people, it's, well, why wouldn't I be asking you for more money? Or why wouldn't I be saying, hey, why am I being asked to do these things that I'm not really good at?
Yeah. Now, clearly underlying all of these pieces is the funding that is available to, you know, to set in motion a sense of what's possible for any given school or organization. For a lot of schools here, and I'm guessing where you are as well, but I'd be curious your thoughts on it. With a shrinking population of people willing to pay, top dollar for this kind of, broad, powerful experience in an independent boarding school, right? They're looking at people who are very happy to have someone, like to have their child go to a place where that's the case. And for that, I'm thinking countries where their economies are humming. You think
Right.
of, rich Chinese families or whatever it may be, where there's that sense of, I want my kid to be able to go and to have an international experience and stay and be with people who speak another language so that they can develop facility with that language and to be exposed to kind of different ideas for how to pursue projects so that you can bring that back to what we do here. Right. I mean, that's not, that's not some wish that's out there. So are you guys also trying to tap the international market for students as well?
I mean, especially, after the financial downturn in 2008, where, the Association of Boarding Schools has an initiative right now called NABI, the North American Boarding Schools Initiative. And the goal is to increase domestic full-pay boarders 20% by 2020. I think that's a lofty goal.
Sounds so.
I think it's a great goal.
Yeah.
I don't know how realistic it is. After 2008, many schools opened up the floodgates to international markets, specifically China. Mm-hmm. And I think that was a temporary solution to a long-term problem. Mm-hmm. Where if you're seeing that demographic slide, I mean, really, if you want more students, what you should be ringing the bell about is, hey, go have more children. Like that's what schools need to say. But obviously that's not anything that anyone's going to listen to.
Right.
So, there
are environmental issues in play there as well.
Yeah. So if you look at millennials having A, not getting married, B, not buying homes, C, not having children, D, if they do, it's much later, and E, am I on E already? E, if they do have children, it's 1 or 2. It's not 4 or 5, which is the way, we traditionally saw it. So I think schools, trying to get the international population in, that gave many schools a shot in the arm. And it gave many schools the opportunity to sort of get their finances in order. But it doesn't seem like there's an exit strategy for that. And actually yesterday, I want to say it was the University of, I'm going to say Indiana or Illinois or somewhere out there. They just announced that they're taking out an insurance policy for losses of international students. So if anything happens in the global market, if there's a problem with, let's say there's a war, let's say there's a global meltdown, let's say China closes its basically this school takes a huge number of Chinese students. Right. And they've taken out an insurance policy. And if they lose it, if they lose that revenue, that's only for 1 year. So it'll cover them for 1 year. Mm-hmm. But I think it's a strategy that made sense in 2008, 9, 10, 11, 12. But there was not an exit plan. There was not an exit plan for it. And, some boarding schools are hugely impacted by it. Some are less. And the ones that are more impacted by it are the schools that probably were marginally financially well off to begin with. Like they had financial issues to start.
Yes.
And now they are really tied on to something. They don't know how to get off the train.
Huh. So moving back from revenue to reasons for taking jobs in particular places. You talked a little bit about approaches to kind of broadening the compensation package to certain kind of perks. You mentioned sabbaticals, you mentioned help with down payment of houses, which seems particularly good for trying to keep people long term, if that's something you feel that's important, right? You talked a little bit about choosing to remove certain kinds of tasks, in exchange for less salary. Just some flexibility there, right? Have you seen other promising or quirky, kind of possibilities that schools or businesses are engaged in that space of, how do I change what we are in order to be able to find the people we want? I've sometimes described Google out here, right, as a place that works to hire the very best people in the world and then do everything possible to keep them, right? Like that's like my short description of what Google is in their hiring.
which is kind of common sense, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that shouldn't be a novel revelation for anyone, but I think one of the challenges that schools face, and particularly boarding schools, is that regardless, if you want to take duties away from people, whether it's you want to reduce a teaching load, reduce a coaching load, reduce a res life load, that job still needs to get done. And you don't have the financial resources to hire the adjunct to plug that hole. So often what happens is you get a reduction in your coaching load. I get an extra coaching season. Right. Now the model and this matrix would be a really challenging one to do. I think it's possible. I think it would take a lot of work on the part of schools, but how could we trade off? You're a top-notch teacher in the classroom. We really want you there. You don't really care about coaching. I love coaching. I'm good in the classroom, but if you said, hey, out of these three things, where would you rather be? Teaching, coaching, or in the Res Life program? And I said, I would love to be coaching. Well, I pick up your coaching. I coach 3 seasons and I get a reduction in something else. So you try to match things. So what I'm losing, you're picking up, and what conversely you're picking up, I'm losing. So this is something that some schools are doing, and it's fairly successful. Some schools are also just relying on adjuncts if they can hire them. And again, if you're a school with a $350 million endowment and you need one section of chemistry taught, you can find somebody to do that. If you're a school that is 90% tuition driven with no endowment, that's not possible. So again, a lot of this depends on the individual circumstances of schools, whether it's a large day school. Let me give you an example. In Philadelphia has a lot of Friends schools. Abington Friends, Germantown Friends, Friends Central, Friends Select, and that market has been shrinking. Because of all of the things we've been talking about. And, the conversation down there has been right-sizing your organization. So maybe you were a school of 1,200 in 2005, and now you're a school of 800. And that's a really hard conversation to have with schools because, the spillover effect of that's a cascading effect where now you're talking about cutting programs and cutting people. And long-term, it's probably a good thing to do, but short-term, it's kind of painful.
Makes sense. Speaking of painful, it's always a bit of a pain to cut short a conversation with somebody who's carrying such interesting ideas to the table. However, we've reached our point in time, and so I encourage everyone who is watching this recording as a part of our meeting this week to do 2 things. First of all, a little bit farther down, you're going to see the opportunity to let us know you were here. Please do that, especially our members. They do that. We know you were here. We're keeping. We do that. If you are visiting from another Rotary Club, make sure that you type your email address in properly, and you will get a message that you can turn around to your secretary to make up for a missed meeting, because we're all trying to keep that 100% attendance. Finally, at the bottom, you'll see the chat space, right? The discussion area, and leave a thought. You might respond to a thought that somebody else has left down. Part of what we look to do is to allow for conversations with lots and lots of different perspectives from the many people from all over the world who will come and take a look at the programs that we offer. So we encourage you to do that. As we usually do, we like to finish things by giving our speaker the last word. And Greg, I'll hand it over to you for the final comment.
I think the final comment is be paying attention to demographic shifts and being realistic about what that means. I think trying to do the wrong things righter is not a good option for sustaining an independent school market. I think it's time for some fairly radical changes in order to continue to deliver education to students in a way that is meaningful and really gives them opportunity. But at the same time is keeping your feet on the ground with regard to the fact that things change. They always do.
Well said. We'll see you next week.